We really did not understand how significant the censorship apparatus was. We didn't understand how its reach. We didn't understand that the U.S. government was directly urging Twitter to censor people.
Hello and welcome to Offscript. My name is Stephen Edgington. As governments and media companies around the world continue to crack down on so-called disinformation, is free speech under threat? To discuss the implications of anti-disinformation units, I'm joined by the American journalist Michael Shellenberger. What is the censorship industrial complex?
Well, the censorship industrial complex is a network of government agencies, non-governmental organizations, many of which are funded by the government, and many news media organizations which believe that disinformation is something that is different than just people being wrong on the internet, and that it's something that requires pretty heavy-handed censorship efforts. We first came across this group of organizations and individuals in the Twitter files. We at first thought that we were just looking at very politically correct, or what you might call woke, content moderation by Twitter. But then we quickly discovered that there was a very organized effort by the Department of Homeland Security, which is a U.S. government agency, but it involved the FBI, it involved people in the CIA, to basically demand that the social media companies engage in much more censorship of disfavored views. And with the Telegraph's reporting, which we paid a great amount of attention to, about the ways in which the government was pressuring social media companies to censor disfavored views, particularly around COVID and COVID vaccines, that was very similar to what we discovered here in the United States. There was actually a very organized effort by 4 organizations in particular to first censor disfavored views of the 2020 elections, and then to censor what they themselves labeled often true content, including information about vaccine side effects that they feared would increase vaccine hesitancy. So the censorship industrial complex is sort of a way that we describe the organizations that are involved, many of which are government organizations, others are government funded. But in some cases, I think as we've seen with the BBC, can often involve government-funded news organizations that are supposed to be independent.
Now, of course, the BBC would argue that they're not technically government-funded. They're funded by the taxpayer through the license fee. And you're right, they have had a disinformation unit, a disinformation reporter who I think is quite prolific. And they've launched this new campaign to try and fact-check, I guess, the news and to fact-check Facebook and things like that. Are you concerned about media organizations getting involved in this disinformation industrial complex, as you call it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing we have to do is consider how strange it would be. I mean, I thought that news organizations, as their mission, were involved in providing accurate information to the public. So what's the difference between the normal reporting that news organizations do and the so-called anti-disinformation reporting? What are they suggesting? I also find the secrecy involved in these groups fighting disinformation to be extremely curious. My colleague, Matt Taibbi, who is one of the Twitter Files authors, his team organized a major report that looked at 50 different organizations within the censorship industrial complex. We reached out to all 50 of them, plus some additional ones. We only heard back from 10 of them, and only one has agreed to be interviewed. We reached out to the BBC's disinformation reporter, Mariana Spring, and requested an interview. BBC denied us an interview. So these are people that have been involved in often secret efforts to censor their fellow citizens, whether in the United States or Britain, but we've also seen similar efforts in Canada and across the English-speaking world, who are taking it upon themselves to demand much greater censorship of their fellow citizens, but they won't subject themselves to any sort of public questioning, to any amount of public debate. So we find the whole thing rather disturbing in the secrecy. And you have to remember that these are people that are demanding very significant amounts of transparency by the organizations that they're targeting. So they spend a lot of time talking about the need for greater transparency by others, but they're not providing transparency about what's going on here, why this sudden interest in disinformation. Isn't this really just a way to discredit and censor voices that they don't want to have heard? And look, we've had this debate. Our forefathers had this debate hundreds of years ago. We've decided that as free societies, we would rather have many views, including disfavored views, including views that most of us don't agree with. We would rather have them out there in public debate because we think we make better decisions that way, and we think it's a fundamental human right. So we view the rise of the censorship industry and of the participation of many news organizations as quite troubling. And I think in some ways it just undermines their own claim to be journalistic organizations. I mean, what were they doing before they had anti-disinformation reporters?
Now, you were referring earlier to the Telegraph's reporting about the Countering Disinformation Unit in the British government during the lockdown pandemic, where you basically had lots of different stakeholders from big tech companies, certain media organisations, including the BBC, and civil servants and officials meeting together to discuss how they should censor what they viewed as COVID misinformation or disinformation. Do you think that that is a grave threat to freedom of speech?
I do. And in particular, I mean, the governments, we have slightly different ethics and rules in the United States and Britain. The United States, we have extremely strong First Amendment of our Constitution protections. We do not have a government regulator of speech. That is not something that we allow. The very few limits that we do impose on speech relate to not defrauding people, using speech to lie and misrepresent what's going on in terms of business, to steal people's money. We also don't allow the immediate incitement of violence, in particular, such as getting a mob going to hurt somebody. But beyond that, we allow a lot of free speech, and frankly, so does Britain, and I know there's been some more restrictions there. But generally, no, we allow freedom of expression. What we saw with both the lockdown files in Britain and now in the Telegraph's new reporting about the Counter-Disinformation Unit, we see identical what happened in the United States. One of the most egregious cases here was we had White House officials demanding that Facebook do much more censorship of people sharing information about vaccine side effects that was true information. I think it's important for people to remember that these demands are being made by progressives, people on the left. People on the left in the United States fought very hard for decades to require pharmaceutical companies to name in their television advertisements the side effects of their products. So to actively censor, disallow people describing the side effects of pharmaceutical drugs, it's outrageous. I mean, it should make every citizen angry and afraid of where this is going. The other thing that we're concerned about is that we've been seeing various censorship efforts on various topics around the world, in Britain, in the United States, in the English-speaking world. And these have covered not just COVID, but also election issues, climate change, racial issues. And now we see constant efforts to generate new panics around so-called increase of hate speech. There's been these accusations that there's an increase of hate incidents. My colleagues and I have looked at this. There is no good evidence suggesting any increase in any form of hate. Our societies in the West are more tolerant in terms of religious, racial, and sexual minorities than they have been ever in their entire history. There's no evidence of backsliding. We've seen there's a British think tank called the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which takes money from both the British and the U.S. government, which claimed an increase of anti-Semitism on Twitter. It was mindlessly repeated by a BBC reporter in his interview with Elon Musk. We looked at the report, and they were actually classifying tweets criticizing George Soros and the World Economic Forum as anti-Semitic. That's absolutely outrageous. Everybody should be outraged by the labeling of political views as anti-Semitic. And frankly, the people that should be the most upset about it are Jews who should not want George Soros to be the representative of all Jews in the world, and should not want false claims made of rising anti-Semitism. This is a very serious issue. If there's an increase of anti-Semitism or hatred in our society, we should know that, and we should not allow people to go around there and spread misinformation, often in the name of fighting disinformation. So you can see where this is going. The people that are often setting themselves up in the business of countering disinformation have themselves been spreading disinformation about things like anti-Semitism, hate speech, and I think we can expect on a range of other issues.
Now, this word disinformation is fascinating. It seems to have become very popular in the last few years. Do you think that disinformation, and what we mean by that is the intentional spread of wrong information, right? It's not just political opinions you disagree with. It's people lying and intentionally trying to mislead people. Do you think that this is a legitimate issue at the moment? Do you think that there has been a rise in so-called disinformation, real disinformation? And if so, what should be done about it?
No, there's no evidence whatsoever that there's been an increase in disinformation. So first of all, the word disinformation comes from the military. It is used specifically in a wartime context, or had been used in a wartime context. It was then picked up by Democrats in the United States, particularly in 2018, and they started to claim that Russian disinformation played a role in the election of Donald Trump. Now, I should say, mainstream political science opinion, mainstream academic opinion does not hold that view, that Russian disinformation had any discernible effect whatsoever on the 2016 elections. In fact, the real issue, Republican voters got most of their news, as you might imagine, from Fox News, not from Facebook. So they grossly exaggerated the role of social media in general. It's not clear how many people even ever saw Russian social media advertisements or Russian disinformation. So what they very quickly then did is they then started to sweep up all sorts of other claims that people were making, people just being wrong or opinionated on the internet, as disinformation. So words are very powerful, and language has a way of hijacking the way the brain functions and our feelings about things. And so people have used that word, and in almost every instance, it's an effort to demand censorship. It's an effort to demand government involvement in censorship. One of the things we should understand is that the United States, and I believe around the Western world, has always allowed for the publication of dissenting views, including foreign views. The CIA itself used to translate the Russian newspaper Pravda so people in the United States could read it. Now, of course, it was accurately labeled, but you see various anti-disinformation folks wanting to basically censor Russia Today, which is the Russian propaganda outlet. But I think most people know that Russia Today is a Russian propaganda outlet. So this became a controversy within Twitter, where Elon was labeling all government or taxpayer-funded media as government-funded media, and then they finally resolved to just not have a different label for them. But basically, you're just seeing people use the word disinformation to basically demand censorship of disfavored views. And so in that sense, I think we should train our brains that when we hear people talking about disinformation or about conspiracy theories, we should be on alert that these are probably situations where people are about to or in the process of demanding censorship.
Now, again, this word disinformation is interesting because the Russian government obviously did try in some ways to influence elections. I mean, every government tries to influence other elections to a certain extent, particularly when you have these foreign actors, these sort of foreign dictators who are trying to make trouble. Do you think that there are any issues with this? You know, the Iranian government, the Chinese government, the Russian government, the Saudis, whoever, trying to influence politics within the United States and in the West? And do you think that there should be any kind of censorship of this if we spot it and are able to stamp it out?
Well, I think you should have counter speech. In other words, it seems like if, for example, there's a debate right now over who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. The Washington Post is out with a story today quoting CIA officials blaming a group of 6 Ukrainians. Color me a little skeptical. I mean, maybe 6 Ukrainians did it. Maybe the U.S. government did it. Maybe the Russians did it. We don't know, but we should have a big debate about it. We should, as journalists, we should be under pressure to name our sources. If we're not going to name our sources, we should explain why we're not naming them and explain why we think these things are true. But on that issue, we saw a very famous American journalist named Seymour Hersh. He won the Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of Vietnam. He's he's been reporting for a very long time. Many people think that his reporting on Syria was wrong. I haven't investigated it myself. We know that much of his reporting on Vietnam was accurate. But nonetheless, he did reporting that claimed that the U.S. government blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, and he was censored on Facebook, explicitly censored. I mean, they put like a black screen over his article. I just don't think that's necessary. I don't think Facebook, as a platform, a supposedly neutral platform, it should be in the business of deciding what's true or false. Allow readers to do that. I mean, some of this is a kind of elitism or snobbery or paternalism. in all these platforms, there's ways for people to respond. I write something controversial and people below it, respond and say you're wrong. And we have a debate. That's how democracy works. Social media platforms are perfect for that. But what we've seen happening is the US government, we've seen the Ukrainian government. In fact, there was a report that the Ukrainians were working with the FBI to demand that Facebook engage in censorship. That was broken by a reporter named Lee Fong, who interviewed a representative of the Ukrainian government. Look, I think the answer to all of this, we've figured all this out hundreds of years ago. The answer to speech we don't like is more speech. We need to have the right to respond to these things. Now, I think the social media platforms inevitably are going to make decisions about what content is allowed. Elon Musk does not allow swastikas, for example, on Twitter. That is a form technically of censorship. My view, and I've testified to Congress about it twice now, has been that the appropriate thing for Congress to do is require transparency, so that if you're going to censor Seymour Hersh, Facebook needs to explain that. It needs to put out an announcement saying, we are censoring this article, here's why we're doing it. And I think they need to give Seymour Hersh an opportunity to respond to his censorship, because, in fact, engaging in that kind of censorship is itself taking a side in a particular argument. And I think that people who, like journalists who depend on their reputations, need to have a chance to respond to the accusation from powerful institutions like Facebook that they got the story so wrong that Facebook won't allow it on its platform.
Now, if I was part of this disinformation lobby, perhaps my argument would be that, for example, there is lots of false information around the vaccines and medical treatments online, and this can lead to negative, harmful side effects or harmful effects on people's health. And if people are being misinformed about certain drugs and things, then that can cause real life problems. So do you accept that there are some issues where when people are lying about things and this can cause real life harm, and we should therefore censor or put warnings or restrict certain posts if we know that they're not true?
I mean, I think the first thing you have to keep in mind, and this has now been pretty well studied by social scientists, is that we find that ordinary members of the public are actually very good at discerning between clearly false information and accurate information. So I just don't think that many people believed that the vaccines, that the vaccine injections included microchips, for example, to cite one famous recent conspiracy theory. On the other hand, what we saw them censoring was accurate information about the relatively low efficacy of the vaccine in preventing the spread of the virus. I think most people are aware that you can, and most people have a personal experience that you got the vaccine and you still got the virus and you still may have transmitted it. So by preventing that accurate information, I think you ended up with a very dangerous situation. So for me, I see stuff on Twitter all the time that's wrong, and so again, I just think that the answer is more speech, not less. I do think that the social media platforms inevitably censor content, and it's just happening all the time. And in some ways, I'm really glad when there's like a controversy about it, because it actually means that there's more debate and more discussion. I mean, this is the whole point of free speech, is that I think it's important for people to remember, because often we point out the cases where proven true speech was censored. But the whole spirit of free speech is that even inaccurate and misleading and so-called dangerous speech, certainly not inciting violence, but certainly all sorts of crazy things, we allow them to be discussed, in part because the rebuttal to them, the response, the debate makes us better, makes us smarter, makes the society allow for better choices. And we think it's fun. I mean, and there's basically been two core arguments for free speech over hundreds of years. One of them is that it's essential, it enables both democracy and free markets. And then the other is just that it's a fundamental human right, and that there's something just fundamentally wrong about depriving people of a chance to express their views.
Now, talking about debate and everything, I know that you're going to be in London soon, and maybe you want to mention your event in a moment. I just want to ask the question first before you do that, though. So you mentioned earlier that they try and explain the election of Donald Trump in 2018 through this idea of Russian disinformation. I suspect they've done the same thing in Britain with Brexit. And do you see this as basically being elites who are unable to accept that people are willing perfectly naturally to vote for, let's say, populist causes like Trump and Brexit without being influenced unduly by so-called disinformation? They just don't They just don't understand why these elections happened, and the only way that they can explain it is by saying that you must have been fooled by some Russian actor or by disinformation.
Yes, definitely what you just described. And look, I mean, I believe in the Western alliance. I think that the West, in fact, in much of my work, I defend Western civilization. I think Western civilization is really good. I support the U.S. role in providing security for our European and Asian partners. I have, at least in the past, supported defending the Ukraines. I think that NATO is mostly a good thing. And so, I think that the people that I think panicked after Brexit and Trump in 2016, I think that they are very worried that the Western alliance is going to fall apart. And there's been some reason to think and to have those concerns, and there's real reasons to be concerned about the rise of nationalism in Europe that none of us need to even mention. So I do think that to some extent those concerns are real, and to some extent I think they're justifiable. But it's sort of a classic problem. Then you're going to undermine the freedoms and democracy that we cherish in the West in order to protect freedom and democracy. These issues at a philosophical level have all been resolved. We're going to allow free expression. We've written it into our constitutions and our laws. And so, yeah, I think you see a kind of panic by the elites. I think some of it is, there's a part of the censorship industrial complex is sort of the inorganic superstructure of an organic cultural wokeism, for lack of a better word. And it's a funny marriage because many of the people in the censorship industrial complex come out of military and intelligence. Clearly, they're more government types. I think in general, that's a culture that tends to be more center-right, more sympathetic to military interventions abroad, for example. More hostile, but hostile to, I think, populism and nationalism, which has often been associated with isolationism, certainly in the U.S., but around the world. So I do think some of it's a panic. I think some of it's just partisanship. A lot of these folks are just Democrats. A lot of the folks came out of the Hillary Clinton campaign, out of the Obama White House. They were upset by Trump's victory. They were offended by Trump. They were offended by the boorish nature of Donald Trump. He's not somebody I ever voted for. In many ways, I share the cultural, reaction to some parts of the Trump presidency. But I do think it's sort of that combination of both kind of genuine concerns about the future of the Western alliance, concerns around populist nationalism, a kind of elite snobbery, and a kind of wokeism, but that one that's been taken advantage of by elites in order to create predicates for censorship.
How do you think that AI will impact free speech?
Yeah, it's a very interesting issue. It's everywhere. So the first thing we're seeing is just so many different reasons are given for why we need to increase censorship. One of them is the risk of so-called deep fakes, which is, of course, a form of AI-generated imagery. We also see, look, there's genuine, so it's one of these things where, of course, you should be concerned about AI. We should all be concerned about AI, and there's a robust debate about how to properly regulate it and manage it. At the same time, we also see it as being used actively as a way to demand more censorship. And so I just think we have to be really careful. Yes, should we worry about Russian and Iranian disinformation? Yes. Should we worry that it's sort of classic, do you worry about the overreaction to it? I mean, in the United States, we're dealing with a country that is very tired of having fought wars that we don't think have been very successful in places like Afghanistan. And now we find ourselves in Ukraine, and there's a big effort to stifle debate about that conflict. So I think we look at all these things and you kind of go, these are real problems. Let's debate them openly and freely, and can we please get beyond the thing where we have to simply defend the right of people with disfavored views to be able to speak and publish. I mean, it's just constant. Like right now, the YouTube is demonetizing and censoring people who have disfavored views on transgenderism by people that are using the natal birth terms for individuals rather than their adopted gender terms. This is an ongoing live debate, and so for the social media companies to kind of unilaterally decide how language is going to be used or what our views of different issues would be, from climate change to transgenderism to the war in Ukraine, COVID, election issues. I just think it's outrageous. If they're going to do it, there should be some requirement that they have to justify themselves and they have to be immediately transparent about their decisions, because ultimately you can't have government requiring the free speech platforms to say or do certain things, but you can require that they be transparent about the decisions that they're making.
Now, you've written a fair bit about the rise of NGOs and fact-checkers who are trying to tackle so-called disinformation. Do you think that when you look at a fact-checking organisation, that they're generally neutral, or would you say they have some kind of political bias, generally?
I think generally the fact-checkers, I think, reflect the bias of the news media, which I think is very much a left-wing bias. I say this as somebody that comes from the left and am sympathetic to many positions of the left, but I don't think there's any real question of this. Look, we've seen this, the arbitrary nature of it, and also I think the authoritarian nature of it, of overly trusting of official state sources. One great example is the fact-checkers all fact-checked and supposedly debunked the claim that COVID may have originated in a Chinese laboratory. The original headline of the Washington Post was accusing Senator Tom Cotton of recycling a so-called debunked conspiracy theory. Well, not only was it not a debunked conspiracy theory, we now know that there have been widespread scientific debate, including in the mainstream news media, of the risk of coronavirus research around the world, including the United States. President Obama actually banned gain-of-function research in the United States because of those concerns. USA Today wrote very long pieces about the history of lab leaks. One of the characteristics of which is that when there were lab leaks, there were often cover-ups and denial by the people that ran the labs, as you might imagine. So for these things to be supposedly be debunked by fact-checkers, they were thus spreading misinformation. They were spreading misinformation that this was a conspiracy theory when it was not, or at least if it was a conspiracy theory, it was a legitimate hypothesis, a legitimate theory to be taken seriously, and a very important one because it actually would have potentially helped with the fight against coronavirus. So I think we now see Germany and Google yesterday just launched an initiative to supposedly pre-bunk false initiatives. This is based on the idea that you can disprove things that people might believe in the future. This is a absolutely bizarre view, a childlike view of truth and reality. Things change. You know, we just had a big media story come out yesterday in the United States about UFOs. UFOs had been viewed as a conspiracy theory, as debunked. We now know for a fact the Pentagon had been studying UFOs for decades. We have Pentagon whistleblowers. So the idea, there's a snobbery to it. There's an arrogance, I think, to the fact-checking industry. There's a lack of humility, a lack of self-awareness. And I think it's not a surprise that many of the people that are involved in that are very young. They're often people in their 20s. I mean, the BBC head of disinformation, Mariana Spring, I believe is 27 years old. I believed bad, crazy, wrong things when I was 27 years old. You know, part of getting older is realizing how wrong you were in the past. And with that comes a significant amount of humility. So there's something desperate and sort of panicky about the entire anti-disinfo fact-checking enterprise. Some of it just also looks like legacy media competing with new media and just trying to discredit all of their competitors. So I think there's a set of poor motivations. I certainly don't think all the mainstream news media is that way, and obviously I think I admire what the Telegraph in particular has done to document the rise of the censorship. And I would just note that the Telegraph itself has documented both the cultural bottoms-up demand for the censorship of people like Roald Dahl, the children's book author, and the rewriting of his texts to make them more palatable to current audiences. That's going on at the same time that we see people in government abusing their powers and demanding social media platforms censor disfavored views and disfavored users.
Now, you've talked a fair bit about big tech companies in this interview. How big of a moment was it when Elon Musk bought Twitter for free speech? How much of an impact has that had?
I mean, it's gigantic. I don't even think we understand what a big deal it was. I mean, we really did not understand how significant the censorship apparatus was. We didn't understand how its reach. We didn't understand that the U.S. government was directly urging Twitter to censor people. We did know from the attorneys general, which have filed a lawsuit against Biden, that they were doing that with Facebook, but the revelations out of the Twitter files were very extraordinary, very serious. There's going to be changes by Congress because of that. I think that many of the groups in the censorship industrial complex will be defunded and hopefully dismantled as a result of it. But it's not just his purchase. We've also seen since then, Elon has been under incredible pressure from governments and from advertisers to censor more speech. Just last week, there was a major controversy because while he was away working on Tesla, his lieutenants censored a documentary film about transgenderism called What is a Woman? And they censored it without him knowing it. When Elon learned about it, shortly after, and I don't know exactly what occurred, but his top censor, the head of the trust and safety department at Twitter, resigned. Elon, I think, publicly said yesterday that they were under a lot of pressure from advertisers not to platform that, or that the advertisers did not want that. They did not want that film, which was broadcast on Twitter for free. They did not want that near their ads. That makes a lot of sense because we've seen a number of corporate advertisers really embrace transgenderism. And so I think what we've seen is Elon make a bunch of decisions that are consistent with his commitment to free speech. He came under criticism for agreeing to censorship by the Turkish government, but as I pointed out and reported, there was the Twitter before he came along was headed down that same path. They had litigated significantly in Turkish courts. They had lost those appeals, and when they did succumb to the censorship demanded by the Turkish government, Twitter did the right thing, and they literally published the government demands, including the lists of people to be censored. That's something that previously Twitter had not done. That's exactly the kind of transparency we need to see more of. I will say, though, that we spent a lot of time in the United States talking about Elon Musk and about Twitter and the decisions he made. But I think the onus is on us as citizens of the free world to demand our free speech rights. And I'm still a little disoriented and surprised that I find myself needing to make the case for that. But we do find ourselves needing to make the case for that because there are many of our fellow citizens who would like to see their political opponents censored more. And I think we need to make the case that we should not want our political opponents to be censored. We should rather want to debate them. And so it is for that reason that I will be in London June 22nd and 23rd. On June 22nd at 7 p.m. at Westminster Central Hall, I'll be with Russell Brand and Matt Taibbi to make the case and really make the case against and expose the censorship industrial complex. And even that, Russell Brand and I and Matt, we don't agree on all sorts of things. We disagree on many things, but we do have a very strong commitment to very broad free speech rights. And so we're doing that on the 22nd. On the 23rd, we are bringing people from around the world, I'm happy to say, from Brazil and Canada, New Zealand, Australia, India, many developing world countries that are fighting for free speech to gather. And the purpose of that meeting is that we would like to see countries around the world adopt a much stronger free speech standard, much closer to our First Amendment standard in the United States. We are tired of, in the United States, having to defend the First Amendment from foreign efforts to impose greater censorship through social media companies, as the EU is currently trying to do. The EU is genuinely trying to censor much more disfavored content, including by Americans. And we're not going to allow that, and we're going to fight and resist that. And that's why we're gathering together in London. And I think it's a very symbolic gathering. And this is a very old relationship that our two countries have had, the United States and Britain. Our free speech laws were inspired by Britain and the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment writers there, and the First Amendment as well was inspired by wanting much freer expression than was traditionally allowed by the British Crown.
Now, you've talked about Twitter there, about Elon Musk. Can you assess some of the other social media companies, and what kind of rating would you give them in terms of transparency and their commitment to freedom of speech?
The big other one, of course, is Facebook, and I would give it a very low rating. I mean, to be fair, Mark Zuckerberg, after 2016, when they accused him of helping to get Donald Trump elected because of Russian disinformation on the website, his initial response was that it was ridiculous. I'm not sure if that was the exact word, but he basically absolutely dismissed it. He was right to do so. There was no evidence that Russian disinfo played any significant or measurable role in Trump's victory. But over the next several years, the Democrats really took Zuckerberg to the cleaners, as we say, constant attacks on Zuckerberg, demanding that he comply with their demands for greater censorship. It's very remarkable. I've now testified in front of Congress twice on this issue. It's quite remarkable to see Democrats demanding more censorship by social media platforms. And so they've really had an impact. So it's been and as I mentioned, Facebook was censoring this controversial article about Nord Stream, which, look, might be wrong. I'm not suggesting that it was accurate. I'm just saying it should have been out there and be debated. So I'm disappointed, very disappointed that Facebook has caved into this. One of the things that Facebook did in response, I think they got overwhelmed by it. They just stopped promoting a lot of news articles. They basically have kind of not allowed the website to be a place for a lot of news. We've also seen some bad behavior by Wikipedia, which participated in an Aspen Institute workshop where they coordinated how not to cover negative information about Hunter Biden. I mean, it's quite shocking when you realize that Aspen Institute was basically holding a workshop to argue against what's known as the Pentagon Papers principle, which is the principle that journalists should publish leaked information, such as the Pentagon Papers that came out in 1969 about the failing U.S. war in Vietnam. And that's been the standard for journalists, that we should publish leaked information, even if the whistleblower is breaking the law, because it's in service of the public interest and it's consistent with our Constitution and the First Amendment. They were actually arguing against that. Wikipedia participated in that. And then there's other social media companies, but none of them have the outsized impact that Twitter and Facebook have. And really Twitter, I mean, you see so much focus on Twitter, the information density allowed by Twitter, the ability of things to go viral. It's just, there's no comparison to Facebook. And so I think that's why we see so much attention to the platform right now. And I think so much reason for why you need to have citizens and governments demanding transparency of these social media platforms, since really anything else, any kind of regulation, I think violates our freedom of speech.
How much did things change in America when Joe Biden became president in terms of free speech and censorship?
Oh, it changed a lot. I mean, there certainly was some cases of the Trump administration demanding censorship by social media platforms, but it was nothing like what occurred after Biden was elected. I mean, we had situations of basically a bullying, aggressive attacks on social media companies by people in the White House, privately over the phone with Twitter and Facebook executives. We saw President Biden himself accusing Facebook of killing people by spreading, frankly, true information about vaccine side effects. We saw Democrats routinely threaten the financial basis of social media platforms, which is known as Section 230, as the part of the Communications Decency Act, which gives very significant liability protection to social media companies by acting as platforms rather than as content providers. And so it's been a significant attack. Unfortunately, I'm sad to say it's come almost entirely from the political left in the United States, but I think that's the case across Europe as well, certainly in Britain. This is very shocking for those of us that came of age in the 1980s and 90s, because the political left during those decades was on the pro-free speech side, defending things like the right of neo-Nazis to march through mostly Jewish neighborhoods, defending the right to burn the American flag. Those were things that were traditionally opposed by conservatives, and now there's been a complete reversal, so that the right now is on the side of free speech and the left is demanding more censorship.
Have you yourself experienced censorship?
I have. I did, and it's very upsetting, and it continues to make me very angry. When my book Apocalypse Never came out in 2020, I accurately said that natural disasters are not getting worse, they're getting better. I was censored for that by Facebook. They said Michael Shellenberger is wrong, that natural disasters are getting better because extreme weather is getting worse. They literally changed the category. Disasters are just deaths and property damage. That's how you measure them, and those have been going down. And extreme weather, I've always said there's evidence that some forms of extreme weather, like greater precipitation and greater heat extremes, are a result of climate change. I've never denied climate change. I've never denied anthropogenic role in climate change. I've never denied that climate change is serious and should be dealt with. But nonetheless, I was censored very outrageously by Facebook for that, and no right of appeal, no chance to plead my case, no place to express on Facebook platform or Facebook to allow me to express that. We have evidence that they're continuing to stifle our account, but it's a form of crazy making in the sense that they won't even tell you if they're stifling your account. Whereas I would point out that when Twitter has removed content or censored content since Musk's takeover, we have seen the trust and safety staff say on Twitter publicly, yes, we did censor you for this and that reason. We did not have that with Facebook. So yeah, it's a issue that I experienced personally, and I'm also sorry to say I think that often that's what it takes for people to be sensitive to this issue. I have a lot of disagreements with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is running for president in the United States right now. I don't agree with his position on vaccines. I don't agree with his position on nuclear power, but his experience being censored has made him very sensitive to this issue, and he gave a really lovely defense of the First Amendment yesterday in his Twitter Spaces press conference. And so I do think sometimes that's what it takes. And so I think at this point we're seeing sufficient people have now been censored and are upset about it, that we're starting to find each other. And actually, it's quite lovely in the sense that I think we're finding people that we don't agree with on many issues who nonetheless share the belief that the solution to wrong speech is more speech, not censorship.
Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.